Ladies and gentlemen, it is your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Now, a few years ago now, more years than I care to even think about, I studied industrial design, which is a really interesting course. I wasn't very good at it, but it did leave me with a lifelong love of plans and technical drawings and things like that. And of course, one of the things I love looking at plans of is ships. And we've already looked at a few classic ships and ocean liners on the channel before, but I thought today we could look at what is probably the greatest ocean liner of the 20th century, one of the finest ships ever built. We're still blessed to have her with us today. That is, of course, the RMS Queen Mary. The name Queen Mary itself is synonymous with luxury and adventure and just general high seas shenanigans on a big old ocean liner. And in fact, I care so much about the Queen Mary that I keep this nice little model of the ship that was sent to me by my friend Alex near me basically at all times. I travel with it. No, just kidding. But I do keep it on my bookcase behind me. That's a cool little model. Queen Mary represented a huge leap forward for the British merchant navy and passenger ships at the time. So that's enough of the preamble. Let's jump in and have a look at Queen Mary's plans and see just what it is that makes her so special. So what we're looking at here is the rigging plan. Now this is an original plan from the 30s that's been scanned, and the rigging plan essentially gives the designers and actually really the owners and agents and things like that a general overview of what the ship's going to look like when it's finished. So it doesn't actually show inside the ship. It's not a cross section, but it does show a lot of details from the exterior, and crucially, it shows basically all of the rigging. Now, by the time the Queen Mary was being built and designed in the late 1920s, ocean liners had changed quite a bit. They required basically, less rigging. And in fact, some ocean liners were being built without really much rigging at all. So as you can see, the Queen Mary is a very elegant looking ship. She's got some classic lines, and there's not a whole lot of rope work and, funnel stays and things like that around, but we'll have a flick through and see from the side profile here what we can get out of it, and then we'll go through and look at the inside of the ship. So let's start at the front, work our way back. It's funny seeing this because I got to visit the Queen Mary last year, and I stood right there. What hadn't really changed a lot by the time Queen Mary was built was the layout of ships' forecastle decks. The very front of the ship, the bow section had to have all this equipment on it. Queen Mary, some criticized her for having quite a traditional exterior appearance. And part of that is that a competitor in the likes of the Normandy had this part of the ship actually covered with a what's called like a whaleback deck or a whale deck, which is essentially just like a cover, and that's the way we really design and build passenger ships today. Often the equipment that sits up here above the nameplate there, the windlass used to bring the anchors up and down, the steam capstans used to actually moor the ship, the bollards used to tie the ropes off, and all this stuff. It's big, it's heavy duty. I think it looks cool, but at the time, passengers might not have enjoyed looking at that. So a lot of passenger ships into the 30s and 40s started to experiment with, well, not a lot, but a few experimented with actually covering that deck off. And they kind of do that nowadays on cruise ships. But Queen Mary was built in the tradition of, in many ways, older ocean liners that had come before her. And that shows in quite a few ways. So Queen Mary's designers went quite traditional on the layout and the actual general construction of the ship. What's really pronounced here, though, is the rake of the bow. So if we just zoom in and have a look off the bat, you can see that the prow, which is the very tip of the bow section of the ship, right here, is heavily angled out forward. And essentially, designers were always experimenting with the hull form. What was the most hydro-dynamic, hydro-efficient hull, the shape to build your ship. And, at the start of, the ocean liners development and into the early 1900s, ocean liners had straight stems. They just went straight up and down. And they realized that by doing that, they were essentially, yes, they were building ships that had very sharp forward ends that could cut through the water like a knife. And they looked like chisels, but they acted like chisels. The ship could pitch in waves. It could drop unexpectedly. It was a relatively, efficient hull form, but it did have some nasty seakeeping characteristics. By angling the bow out that way, you essentially have more ship above the waterline where the bow is, and you actually get some better seakeeping. You have a more manageable pitch in big waves and things like that. And what isn't apparent from looking at this is that the Queen Mary's bow isn't kind of like as sharp as you'd expect. It has quite a pronounced curve to it, which is quite an interesting characteristic of the ship. One of the other really interesting things of the Queen Mary's exterior design at the bow here is this huge anchor well cut out in the side of the bow there. So that's one of these iconic visual cues that this is the Queen Mary. The Queen Elizabeth had something very similar. It basically means that the anchor can be dropped from here. The bow flares out quite significantly at this point from the sides. Essentially to create a drier ship, so it's not pitching down into the water. There's more ship above the waterline to keep it going along. But of course, in order to bring the anchors up, they need to have this huge well cut out so that they could fit snugly home and stay there. If you want to learn how anchors work, we have a video about that as well. We just did it, and it's pretty good. So this is where we start to see that there's still a lot of traditional elements of the Queen Mary's design. I'm going to fly through this plan because I think the more interesting stuff is actually on the inside of the ship. But you can see that there are these cargo hatches. There's one here. There's one here. There's a little one at the bow. And, Queen Mary still had to load cargo in the traditional sense. There were still stevedores or, dock workers whose whole job it was to load big burlap sacks of mail and just goods and crated things like artwork and cars and you name it. And it had to be loaded onto the ship. And the way that the Queen Mary would be able to load up cargo is essentially she'd use these big cargo derricks, these booms that sit one here, and they essentially splay out from where the mast is. She had a whole bunch of steam winches and, lines could be rigged to those. And when she was in port, those derricks could be, sent over the side. Men would essentially really just, with guidelines, pull the derricks around, drop them, and then rig the derrick with a hook to the cargo that it needed to pick up and, winch it aboard and drop it down through the cargo hatch and load it that way. And it was a very lengthy process. And of course, nowadays, passenger ships, first of all, don't need to carry cargo like this because they're not subsidizing crossings with really cargo in that way like they were back in the day. There is a much more efficient method of loading cargo in ships nowadays called the cargo container, which was a brilliant bit of design that came about in the mid-20th century. It essentially means that you can just put things on a ship in a container and stack them. It's amazing that it took us that long to think of that as a species. But anyway, one of the other things about Queen Mary, we'll come back to this in a minute, but we can see that the bridge, stands up kind of like a tower. It's quite pronounced. The forward superstructure, which is this entire area here, is this magnificent, very iconic looking curved structure that is really quite, on the face of it, looks a little Art Deco. The truth is, though, that it is really a holdover from older Cunard line ships, like the Campania had that, and she was from the 19th century. Lusitania and Mauretania had essentially this kind of superstructure front. And so really, Queen Mary is, yes, she's a big, impressive ocean liner of the 1930s, even though she was designed in the late 20s. But she's essentially borrowing design cues from much older ships in the Cunard fleet. So there is actually quite a significant bit of visual consistency over the fleet. So you can see in Lusitania and Mauretania, you can see a lot of Campania and her sister. And, over time, they're just growing the ships in size, but keeping a lot of visual aesthetic things. One thing that has changed a lot on the Queen Mary since the days of Lusitania are the funnels. Now, she has 3 funnels because funnels kind of a little bit went out of fashion for a long time. The more funnels, the bigger they are, the more powerful, the faster your steamship will look and good for you. But maybe partly because so many 4-funneled ocean liners met a tragic end. You had the Titanic, you may have heard of that one, Lusitania, Britannic. It kind of did shatter public confidence in the idea of the unsinkable ship. And so, 4 funnels being so majestic and powerful, in the late 1920s, you start to see ships go down to having 3 funnels. And then you have some of the biggest and fastest ships in the world, like the Bremen and the Europa. And they just had 2 funnels, and that became kind of like the aesthetic thing for the 30s and then into the 40s as well. But what's interesting about the Queen Mary's 3 funnels is that they're not the same size. So there's a clue to this here, actually. You can see they've marked out on this plan, which, again, can we just pause for 1 second? I will come back to that and just say how beautiful these plans are. Like, these are incredibly detailed. But they were drawn by hand by teams of designers working over, huge pieces of paper in drawing offices. It just always blows my mind. So you can see here there's actually... You can see here there's notes for the rake. So we mentioned that the bow of the ship has a pronounced rake to it. That's the angle at which it's going out that way over the water. The funnels are raked as well. Now, they are raked backwards. So you can actually see here the angle that they are raked to. So the forward funnel here is raked back. It's 1 7/8 inches per foot. The second funnel is 1 15/16 inches per foot. And then the other one is 2 inches per foot. They're getting slowly more angled back the further back they go. So the third funnel is the most angled back. But it's also the smallest. If you look, if we take a line and draw it from the first funnel here and go all the way back, it misses the second funnel and then it completely misses the third funnel. So they're actually getting smaller and more angled back. Now, this is purely aesthetic. The truth is that by doing that, it makes the ship look more aggressive. It makes the Queen Mary look like she's standing up straight, that she's going somewhere in a hurry. And by having the funnels going back like that, it kind of plays like a bit of a perspective trick on the eye, and it just gives the ship this kind of like upright standing stature, really, that makes it look like she's ready to go somewhere and go somewhere quick. And that's kind of like the trick here that they're trying to convey is not necessarily just size and power, but also, of course, the most important part of an ocean liner's existence, which is speed, that ability to maintain that regular crossing. Now, one thing that the Queen Mary has very obviously stuck with in her design is funnels that still require significant external bracing. So this is a rigging plan, and as we mentioned, you can see all the rigging required, all the steel rope, essentially, required to keep those funnels upright and in place. Now, her sister, Queen Elizabeth, was designed so that her funnels were internally braced, and they really didn't need any exterior ropes or wires or anything like that. And so this was like around about the time that you start to see this external bracing of funnels begin to go away, which is really interesting. But the other thing that you notice is that she's absolutely covered in aerials. So Queen Mary had a number of wireless systems, the most obvious being her wireless communication, the Marconi radio, where she could speak to the outside world. That needed its own quite high power system with a very big aerial. And as on other ships like Titanic and Olympic and Lusitania and other liners from that era before, the most convenient place to put it was between the masts. So you can see that between the masts here, you've got these 3 antennas, essentially. These are just like big metal ropes. They act as an antenna for the wireless system, so they give her a very significant range, hundreds of miles. And the way that you can tell that these are antennas is because of these little bead-looking things, which are insulators. The insulators effectively act like insulators that you see on power lines, on power poles when you walk out on the street. They make sure that the line, which is a live wire with a huge amount of voltage going through it, isn't actually what's contacting the pole. Because if you went on the pole and it was, you'd probably get a shock. So you start to notice there's actually quite a lot going on here. And even rigged between the funnels here, you can see some antennas. So you can actually see there's insulators here. Because Queen Mary also needed a wireless system of sorts for her for one of her navigation systems, which was essentially like a triangulation system that relied on a wireless signal from a fixed point communicating with the Queen Mary, and they could communicate and they could coordinate their location or determine their location from comparing those against another, fixed point. And so they used a wireless signal essentially to do that. So Queen Mary is just covered in wireless antennas. And so really we're starting to see with this generation of liner just how important this electronic communications system is becoming in ships. And eventually when she was, in the later stages of her career, she'd have things like radar. And it's amazing that I think, Queen Mary existed in a world where, she served before the Second World War as a liner, during World War II as a troop ship, and then afterwards into the 50s and then the 60s. And so she saw this huge amount of change, but her bones, her skeleton is really a ship from generations earlier. The other thing that's interesting is all these doors. The ship's covered in doors on the outside. You can see them here. There's just pairs and pairs and pairs of doors. The Queen Mary was expected to operate between Southampton and New York with stops in Cherbourg. And, the more access points you can put into the ship, the better. So she was a 3-class ship as built, first, second, and third. And so being such a big ship, carrying so many passengers, hundreds and hundreds of passengers, she would need, a lot of access points so that boarding day could be done as effectively as possible. Some of these had to be down by the waterline. You can see there's a few down here, but we'll come back to those in a minute because she had a secret, cool little feature that we'll discuss when we go to the next set of plans. Then, of course, we get to the rear end of the ship, the stern. Now, what's really interesting about this area is that the design of ship sterns had changed quite significantly from the 1910s into the 1920s. For the longest time, ships' sterns had copied sailing ships, so clipper ships, with what was called the counter stern. It was a very, thin, kind of knife-like, sharp stern profile and rises up into this nice big curved spoon-shaped counter. Now, early engineering on ships had basically dictated that this was a very, hydrodynamic shape, and it is. It will cut through the water quite quickly, but it does create significant turbulence. And so the truth is that actually having more ship in the stern at the waterline is more hydro efficient, and you will be able to get more speed out of the ship by including essentially more stern in contact with the water at the point at which the stern ends, if that makes sense. So the Queen Mary has what's called a cruiser stern, which, first of all, looks great. Second of all, it's a really, hydro efficient hull form. And cruiser sterns are, in some cases, still in use today. It's all to do with the relationship between the hull shape and the desired speed of the ship during its operational speed. When you hit your operational speed, the point at which the ship is expected to spend the most of its time cruising at that speed, that's the point at which the water, as it tumbles along the hull and afterwards, will be behaving in the way that you want it because you've designed the hull to do that. So it's a very, very complex equation. It's all to do with the speed. Queen Mary's speed is all to do with the schedule that she has to maintain, crossing from Southampton to New York. So you can see it's really all a big equation, like a formula-based design process, designing ships like this, and it impacts things like what the stern looks like. And nowadays you'll see that ships just have kind of like an ugly, flat transom stern where it just kind of ends. The truth is that that's a really hydrodynamic stern shape because you have basically so much stern in the water at the point at which the ship ends that at cruising speed it's a pretty efficient hull form. So let's move on and have a look inside the ship. We'll go down to one of the top decks and we'll quickly move down below and see what we can see. Okay, so this is the arrangement of the deck houses. So this is the very top level of the ship. Now this is almost exclusively crew space with a couple of exceptions. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we'll start at the very top and we'll talk about the compass platform. Now, the more compasses you can have on your ship, kind of the better. It's good to have backups. A compass is extremely important, obviously. But you can see that there's actually quite a lot more going on here. You know, she's got a wireless direction finder. That's the piece of machinery I was just telling you about earlier. The direction finder is really critical in understanding your bearing and where you are as you're approaching port, because anyone who's ever taken a transatlantic crossing or has spent a bit of time around the ocean will know that, especially off the US East Coast, things can get crazy foggy, and on the other side of things in England as well. It's very difficult to understand where you are, and even an experienced skipper can lose track and run a ship ashore, essentially. So that would be catastrophic for a vessel like the Queen Mary. So they've actually fit quite a bit onto the compass platform here that's really, really useful for navigation. One of those things is also a pair of searchlights. Searchlights really started to get added to ships, relatively late, I guess, like in the 20s and 30s, for example, on the Queen Mary here. Not like giant ones that you might have seen on the German Berlin trio, like the Imperator, where they were just these huge kind of like military styled searchlights. But these little ones are useful for, ostensibly looking if someone has gone overboard, perhaps, or just a useful tool to have in your arsenal of tools. Then essentially below that, so that little compass platform sits on top of the bridge here. So now we're looking through the compass platform at the bridge. You can actually see there's quite a bit of equipment. Ships' bridges had been very simple affairs. Ships' bridges were literally a bridge. The reason they called that is because they spanned, both sides of the ship. You would have one of the helms, so the ship's wheel. To begin with, they were unprotected, but then they started putting them in little things called wheelhouses. But the rest of the bridge would be open. You would have an engine telegraph. You would have maybe a Polaris or a compass platform. And that was really it. And then as time goes by and the ships are becoming more and more complicated, you started getting things like electric telephones, and then you had more engines, so you needed more engine telegraphs, docking telegraphs. So because ships got so big, there are, a dozen seamen at the stern of the ship waiting for orders on, hey, when do we cast off these lines so that the ship can go out to sea? How are you going to get word to them 800 feet away at the bridge? Well, you'd need either a telephone, and they had those, or you need a telegraph. And the docking telegraph, was marked out with things like let go Springer, heave in line, tugs clear, that kind of thing, so that both the bridge and the other side of the ship at the stern, and even the bow, could communicate with each other. And so, they start to get really complicated. So by Queen Mary's day, the bridge is actually entirely enclosed. And this is, sort of unusual, because this was an uncommon practice. The British, especially the Navy, loved having open bridges. They just loved being in the weather and being rained on. It must just be an English thing, I guess. But, at this point, the bridge has become such a complicated piece of technology in and of itself that it has to be protected and enclosed. And it doesn't matter how big your ship is, you're still going to cop big waves over the bow. And history tells us that the designers got it right, because the Queen Mary copped a couple of absolute beauties in her time that reached the bridge. So yeah, the bridge is pretty complex. She's also got a gyroscopic compass room, the gyro room in here. I mean, that's a new piece of technology for the time. Very impressive piece of navigating equipment. You've got your classic voice pipes and things like that. There's a flag locker. But what's really interesting comparing the Queen Mary to other ships just before her is actually how complicated this technology is starting to become. It was the gyro repeaters that were really her navigational, the ace up her sleeve, because they were just such a brilliant piece of navigational equipment, and they basically served her all her life. Moving back, we actually get to some unusual sections of the ship that we often don't really get to talk about, but the dog kennels. You had first-class passengers traveling back and forth between New York and Southampton. The richest of the rich want to take their dogs with them, so have to give them some good accommodations as well. And there are great photographs of crew walking dogs on the Queen Mary's decks in this general vicinity, because there were the kennels there. And in fact, the Queen Mary 2, the modern version of Queen Mary, still has kennels as well. And they're in a very similar position, just below one of the funnels. Now, where Queen Mary doesn't really push the bar in terms of technological advancement is here. Vent to boiler room. She's covered in big, fat, open mouth vents, which, in my humble opinion, make her look very distinguished and classic, and like, you know, we feel nostalgic about them. But the truth is that they're just really cluttered, and that was the way that you did it, because, you know, you've got a big steel-hulled ship that is enormous, just absolutely monumental, and then down in the bottom of it, you know, like 4 stories underwater, you have a bunch of men trying to, you know, feed the boilers oil and operate the ship. And they need to get air into the boilers to essentially encourage, you know, optimal burn, and also ventilate the boiler rooms out. Enclosed spaces on ships, bad. Very, very bad. So ventilation's absolutely crucial. And really, at the time that the Queen Mary was being built, there was technology for more forced ventilation, so you can have big fans drawing air in. And, you know, the Normandy and the Queen Elizabeth realized, the designers of those ships realized, that you could actually do away with these vents, and you could actually just have deck houses where the funnels are lined with louvered gratings, and they could be drawing air in. You didn't need to have these big fat vents, you know, cluttering up the top deck, so they got rid of them. But in the same style as, you know, the Lusitania and the Mauritania, the Queen Mary had those vents. Here's an interesting thing. Stowed position of accommodation ladder. Now, one of the interesting little functions of the Queen Mary was that she had a pair of cranes either side of the second funnel here, a pair of cranes. We'll see them in the next plans, but they were there even though they're at the top of the ship, and there's no cargo hatches around. So you might be thinking, why are there these tall cranes right in the middle of the ship, all the way at the top? They're there to swing out the accommodation ladder. Now, you know, Queen Mary, like I said, she had to call at Cherbourg. She might have to, you know, take on survivors of a sunken ship, for example. Their lifeboats might wash up. The problem is, your ship is 10 stories tall, so how are you going to get these people safely onto the ship? You need some kind of gangway, some kind of ladder that you can lower over the side and rig it so that it's just at the waterline, and then you can basically tie the other end off at a door, one of those many doors that we saw in the side of the ship. And that's what they have. It's called a accommodation ladder, a gangway that is portable, and you can actually just, like I said, swing it out over the side of the ship, rig it to a door, put the other end at the waterline, or really wherever you need it to be. Then people can just walk up it like a normal staircase and board the ship that way. So you could use it on tenders, on lifeboats, on all kinds of things. So it was a really useful piece of kit, and not many transatlantic liners of the time had a system like that at all. They were really popular on ships that were expected to go out to the East Indies and like Asia and things like that, where they would encounter typically like, you know, smaller boats often, like bumboats and things like that. Warships always had accommodation ladders, but a little bit unusual to see them on transatlantic liners, I guess. So yeah, that's a really cool little feature. We'll see the cranes where they are in the next set of plans, because they are on the deck below. Yeah, coming back here to the third funnel, you can see that there's these floodlights everywhere. So this is a series of lights that just look good. You can see that there's a pair of them in between all the funnels. So there's 2 there. Is there one? Maybe there's not one back here. It means, you know, at night they could shine on the funnels and it would just look really good. The truth is that for the longest time, you know, ships' funnels hadn't been lit up at night. I mean, they're the most distinguishing, you know, distinctive feature of the ship's exterior, and they would just leave them unlit. And so from, you know, like around about the 20s and 30s, you start to see a little bit more showmanship with some of these liners. And yeah, you can see that they had specific floodlights installed to show off those funnels. So we're now down on the sports deck, which is the deck below all those, the deck house tops where the bridge was. And there's a lot of very interesting things on this deck. So we'll start at the forward end and work our way back. You can already see that there is kind of like this big block of apartments, as it were. This is a very clever design feature of the Queen Mary, is that you have to keep your crew, your officers, separate from the rest of the crew, first of all, and from the passengers. But you also have to keep them close to the bridge so that they can do their duty in a heartbeat. The clever way of doing it was to just essentially build a tower where the officers have their berths just below the bridge, and the deck above is the bridge. And they, in theory, would be able to do their jobs, apart from going on watch and inspecting the ship, just from this forward tower. So you can see that there's, interestingly, actually, a dedicated captain's room here, but then just below it, there's a Commodore's room. So Cunard Line appointed a Commodore of their fleet. It was usually their most distinguished captain, and the Commodore was given his own accommodations. The truth is, though, that because Queen Mary was the flagship for Cunard for so long, that often her captain was the Commodore of the line. So I wonder if this cabin was ever given out to like VIPs, like, the Percy Bates, the chairman, or anyone like that. It's in a pretty cool spot. But looking back, you can see actually more of those floodlights I was telling you about, which are all shining up at the funnels. So you can see the first funnel is surrounded here by lights, like pointing straight at it, essentially just lighting it up and making it look cool. One thing that hasn't changed on ocean liners from back then is the concept of having the emergency lifeboat. So this is a ready boat. It's always swung out. It's ready to go. It's smaller than the other boats. It's powered with a motor, and it's just ready to go. In case someone falls overboard, you can quickly mount a response. These ones, you can see, were about 30 feet long, and they could only take about 46 people. So not very big boats, but all ocean liners of the era would have an emergency boat ready to go, just in case. Queen Mary was no exception. Behind that, we can see one of her main boats. This one is steel, so they're all steel boats, and you can see that they're actually designed to carry 145 people. Now, in the wake of the Titanic disaster, ships obviously were expected to carry more boats, but it's not just the number of boats you have necessarily, I guess. It's also the size of the boats. Titanic's boats were 30 odd feet long, the big ones. They were wooden, clinker built. They were heavy, but they could only carry about 60 to 70 people. These are probably relatively lighter in terms of their construction, but much wider. I mean, they're not that much bigger than Titanic's lifeboats. These are 36 feet long. Titanic's main boats were around 30 feet long. They can take 145 people each. It's just an amazing jump in lifeboat design and construction and technology. They were also housed on gravity davits. Gravity davits were the cranes that were designed to lower the lifeboats into the water, and they're a very, very clever system, and they're essentially still in use today. Or essentially you have a davit that's just sitting up there inboard with a lifeboat attached to it, and then if you need it, a motor can essentially, or really gravity, can unlatch the davit's position. It will just like slide down and then gently swing the lifeboat out over the side. Now, the Queen Mary's boats were so big and so heavy that the traditional method of lowering boats wasn't going to work. The traditional method of lowering boats was to have a team of men holding the line, keeping the boat up, and slowly let that out. It was jerky, it was not very quick, and it was just, like archaic. So by the time the Queen Mary came along, every boat was given essentially its own paired winch so that they could lower or raise the boat using power. And you can start to see that there are dedicated boat lowering stations right here, which was essentially a platform that sat above the passenger sun promenade deck, the open promenade, where crew in an emergency could get up there, rig the winch to the boat, and lower it down to the evacuation point, load it with passengers, and lower away. And so this is really actually a setup that is very, very, very similar to the way that lifeboat stations are organized today. In fact, honestly, really, it's identical. It's just that the winches have changed largely in their design. They're more powerful and more effective nowadays, but this is huge forward thinking for from a safety perspective. It's very, very cool. Queen Mary could, carry significantly more passengers in her lifeboats than she'd ever be expected to carry during peacetime. During wartime, when she had like 15,000 people on board, maybe not so much. But, as an Oceanliner, she was expected to cater for every passenger and crew member on board, and she could more than do that. So well done, Queen Mary's design team. Conveniently located here in the middle of this picture is this nice big circle that shows the arc of the cranes that I was telling you about. Those cool little cranes that are designed to swing on out and lower the accommodation ladder from the top of the second funnel deckhouse right here. It would pick it up from that point there and swing it out over the side and lower it. Very clever little bit of technology. The upper decks of the Queen Mary are, as you can see, a little bit of a mess. There's just a lot going on. There's a lot of, there's the gymnasium, and there's the squash court, and there's the dog kennels, and here's a boiler room hatch, and here's a vent, and here's the lift machinery. So there's just a lot of stuff going on. But then in between some of these spaces that are just covered with machinery and things like that, you just have like open deck space. And so this is where they squeezed in first class deck game spaces. So you can see one here. It could be used for like deck tennis and things like that. There's another like a very small deck games space here. The dogs were walked somewhere around here. Yeah. There's photographs of them walking the dogs around these decks around here, because obviously the kennels are there. But then moving back in between the second and the third funnel, you have the space for the lounge dome. And this is essentially what designers of ships like this are always trying to do. They're trying to, create the illusion of more space inside than there probably actually is, just make the rooms look bigger. And so you'll often see a lot of rooms exceeding the space that they would normally take up going into the deck above, and you've essentially got like a raised ceiling or a cutout for a dome. So this is, the Queen Mary's magnificent first class lounge has this big rectangular dome. It's essentially just a big vacant space at the top that lets a lot of natural light in because of these big fat portholes, which is very cool. And then going back, we have a lot of engine room stuff. So the fan room here, this is what I was telling you about earlier, is, starting to use the, spaces that are, deck houses for the funnels and things like that, putting fans in them that would otherwise be cluttering the top decks. You see it on Titanic, you see it on Lusitania, you see it on plenty of other ocean liners like that before this generation of ship, they just had these fans and things littering the decks. And I mean, I think there's something charming about that, but, it looks cluttered and it doesn't really look that good. So they're starting to put effort into, as you can see here, these fans and things are in a dedicated room. They're closed in, they're not littering the deck house, and they're starting to hide them away. And nowadays you'd be very hard pressed on a passenger ship to find really any piece of machinery, like a fan or something like that. They're all housed in rooms, which, good for you. Your ship doesn't look that cluttered, but I don't know. I like seeing the machinery. Surprise, surprise, right? And then, so here you've just got big vacant deck space. This was later on totally converted into a huge accommodation block, essentially for engineers. Interestingly, as built, you can see here the the aftermost boats actually had their own wireless apparatus fitted, which is a brilliant idea because until that point, you would send off your wireless message and then hopefully someone got the distress call, you'd lower your boats away, and then that would be it. And you would be able to communicate with the outside world anymore. But by the time the Queen Mary came along, they had designed wireless apparatuses that could fit in motor launches like this. The only issue is, of course, that the Queen Mary has that big wireless antenna between the masts. A motorboat like that is only going to have a very small antenna, so it won't have the biggest range. But at least, in theory, you'll be able to speak with rescue ships as they're coming towards you. I could really talk about these plans all night because they're so beautifully detailed. I've kind of already been speaking for 45 minutes, so I'm going to wrap it up on this deck. Now, we've actually gone 2 decks now down from the last one that we're at. We were just on the Sun deck. We are now down on the Promenade Deck. It's called the Promenade Deck because it has a big promenade on it. You can see that basically wrapping around the ship is a lot of blank space. And this is a nice enclosed promenade. And anyone who has been on a cruise ship or a transatlantic ocean liner, there is only one still operating, with me will know that I will not shut up about enclosed promenades. There's just something so cool about an enclosed promenade. It is like a big glass house. You can walk and you can do laps and you can, feel like you've walked around while staring at the sea, but without getting your hair in the wind and, getting rained on. And, the North Atlantic can be pretty nasty. So having a big space like this to walk around or to sit and read a book and watch the ocean go by is very cool. They don't build ships really with enclosed promenades anymore. I think it's the biggest tragedy of modern day ship design. And the reason is that this is like prime balcony cabin space. People argue with me about, not argue, but they debate the concept of the enclosed promenade. And they say, but you have a balcony now that serves the same purpose. And I say, no, you can't walk, up and down. It's a different thing. Nowadays, it's all about selling tickets and providing balconies. That's all people want. And so this prime real estate, instead of being a cool, open communal space where you can line deck chairs and go for walks and be totally protected by from the ocean by these big glass windows that gives you this awesome panoramic view of the outside, that's been deleted and it's been turned into balcony cabins. So whatever, that's the way it goes. But if any naval architect is watching this, can you please just bring back the enclosed cabin, the enclosed promenade? This is the first class space. So this is all some pretty bougie stuff. Now, like I said at the start of the video, the Queen Mary still exists. And what's so cool about that is that you can go and see all this for yourself because it's still there, which I gotta tell you is very cool. And it's funny seeing this because I've got happy memories of being in this room with friends and getting to experience it. There was a band playing right here when I went on board. They performed Thursday nights, I think, and so I boarded the ship and my stateroom was actually 2 decks down on the starboard side. I could hear the jazz music floating down from above and it felt a little ethereal, and I walked up and walked into this beautiful bar, the Observation Lounge and Cocktail Bar, which looks the same virtually as when it was built and put on the ship for the first time. And everyone was dancing, and it's just such a beautiful experience. So anyway, this is all still there, and you can actually go on the Queen Mary and experience most of this deck, which is really cool. So the Observation Lounge is like an iconic Queen Mary first class space. It's really beautiful, and it's at the forward end of the ship where they probably wouldn't put this kind of cocktail bar nowadays. Typically, on ships like this, this space would be taken up with things like gymnasiums and things like that, because you're copping a lot of weather as you're going along at this forward end of the ship. You can see that there's some pretty heavy duty stuff here. We've got a hinged watertight door here, because you'd be shipping big waves over the bow, and you'd need to protect this part of the ship. There was a Italian ocean liner that took a wave over the bow, and because her superstructure had been built with aluminum, as you American viewers would say incorrectly, she shipped a big wave over the bow, and that aluminium superstructure was badly damaged, and actually a couple of passengers were heavily injured and killed because of that collapse. So this is a very delicate, really delicate part of the ship. So it needs to be heavily engineered. And interestingly, Queen Mary's designers decided to put a lounge, a public room, right at the front of the ship where they'd be copping some pretty heavy weather in big seas. So bold maneuver. Obviously it worked because the bar lounge is still around, and I'm very glad for it because it is magnificent. So moving backwards, we start to see things like the main hall. You know, this is, again, it's a main congregating space for the ship. But what's interesting, and what you don't actually really get from this plan, is that this floor and the deck outside are not on the same level. The main hall, everything basically in this deck house is one, a little bit down, basically like a staircase landing down from the promenade deck outside. This goes back to that trick I was telling you about, trying to create more space inside your ship. Instead of raising the ceiling, you can lower the floor. So the floor for this part of the deck is actually lower than the deck outside, and so there are these access stairways here that go outside and lead up to the outside of the ship. Fun fact, there is a housing over this stairway that is kind of like angled downwards. It looks a little bit like a slide. Those hatches and on those stairways are traditionally called boobies, or like booby stairs. I don't know if the editor's going to cut that out, but it is a technical maritime fact. So, Jay, if you're watching this, and keep all of this in, do not delete this. They are called booby hatches or booby stairs, and they are on older ships. They're like curved. Like the Queen Mary, they are straight down. They look like a slide. I may have slid down one when I was on board. Don't tell anyone I said that. They're constantly trying to come up with ways to create more space on the inside of the ship, and they really did it with the Queen Mary by just doing that one simple trick. But again, for all of her design steps forward, there's always some concessions to the limitations of the technology. Nowadays, we design ship superstructures with lightweight metals. They're a lot lighter built, but while being stronger because the quality of steel has significantly improved. We can use less steel then essentially and make it more flexible and but still maintaining the strength, but also from welding. Welding means you can have a very strong ship. But back then, the superstructure of the ship that sits on the hull, it needed to be able to essentially fold and bend with the ship's hull as it went over big waves. So the Queen Mary's superstructure is essentially interrupted by a series of big expansion joints that bisect the ship crossways, as we can see here. There's 1, 2, 3 forward there. And they essentially mean that the superstructure won't be ripping. And they have been welded over now. The superstructure's expansion joints are gone. But once upon a time they were there, and they really helped with the natural wear and tear that would be exerted on this part of the ship. When we're talking about the sheer number of gangway doors on the Queen Mary's hull, well, there are even doors up here because what if you wanted to board through into the promenade deck? Well, now you can because we have doors. Here's the lounge. They're very proud of the fact there is a parquet floor. It is a spectacular space. They've even marked in the stage with the piano. And this is a very 20s and 30s thing. Actually having a dedicated space for people to do a social activity that was becoming extremely popular at the time. The secret to what that thing is the fact that the floor is parquet. It's a timber floor. You can dance on it. Previously, in the older generation of liners, you would have, superbly carpeted rooms that, yeah, they could be converted into like an impromptu performance area. But with the rise of the jazz age and, some of the great musicians of the 20s and 30s, people were enjoying music in a different way than they had through history. And so they were wanting to dance. And so the big thing was to have parquet floors and a stage so people could dance together. And so there would have been some very enjoyable nights, I think, held in this room with this nice big parquet dance floor. Unfortunately, a lot of these spaces now are gone. When Queen Mary was sold to the city of Long Beach, a lot of these spaces, weren't really going to get any use. I mean, you've got the lounge there with its stage. Why do you need, a ballroom? Why do you need another space? These promenades, that's wasted space in some cases. There are other promenades yet on the ship. Fortunately, virtually all of these promenade spaces still exist on the Queen Mary, so you can go and experience the magic of an enclosed promenade. But a lot of these spaces are gone, especially second class, like tourists, third class. They're virtually all gone from the ship. And those that are deep down in the hull are essentially inaccessible. So this forward half of the promenade deck is in pretty good nick at the moment, and a lot of it is accessible. The second half, not so much. I think a part of it has been turned into a restaurant, and yeah, the famous long gallery, unfortunately, is long gone. Long gallery, long gone. But yeah, these were, you had to provide as much space to keep your passengers occupied and entertained while they're on their voyage as possible across 3 different classes. So, they had to be constantly fitting in public rooms where they could. What's interesting about this is that, first class goes all the way back here, and then it abruptly ends, and then it becomes second class, where you've got now a smoking room, and you've got the dome over the lounge, and they've just like jammed this all in right at the back of the ship. So the designers are constantly, like I said, trying to find ways to, keep the classes separated, because it was still a, very rigidly enforced structure of, divisioning the classes, but at the same time, making the most of the space. We're going to finish on this this point here. I was telling you about, raising the ceilings, lowering the floors where you want to get more space inside, essentially. You can actually see that they've marked this out, which is quite clever. Tween deck height, 10 feet outside houses. So essentially what that means is that the height of the deck outside of the public rooms and all those things, inside of the ship, essentially inside of the promenade, 10 feet. The tween deck height is 14 feet inside. So it's 4 feet lower than the promenade deck, which is a brilliant bit of design, because you're adding, a 14-foot ceiling is very tall. And when you're in the main hall here on the ship, it feels very, very tall. And this is probably the thing that marks out ships of this generation from ships before, is that they were constantly doing this, tricky design whereby lowering floors and raising ceilings and things like that, they're able to install portholes and windows that could allow more natural light along the line of the deck above into the ship. They, without needing like a skylight, or you could essentially just have like a taller ceiling. They did do it a little bit in the Edwardian age. You really started to see it take off with, German ships actually. Like the Barlin trio used that trick a lot by actually lowering and having a tween deck arrangement. But by the time of Queen Mary, it had essentially been perfected. So it's a really unique quirk. It's quite a cool feature of the ship to see that. It's neat that they actually marked it out for us, because I didn't know what the exact height difference was. But you notice when you go into the main hall, you have to go down these stairs, and it's 4 feet down, and then you walk into a nice open space inside. Very cool. Well, that's about all we have time for today. I've spent probably the better part of an hour talking about the Queen Mary's plans, but it's been a lot of fun. I could probably keep going as well, because she's a beautiful ship, and the plans are really, really well drawn and very detailed. So maybe we'll have to do this again sometime. You know what? We'll do a Queen Mary Part 2. There you go. Queen Mary Part 1, done. We'll do a Queen Mary Plans Part 2 in the near future. If there are other ships you'd like to see me cover and talk about their plans, please leave some suggestions in the comments below, because I would love to check them out. I may be a unemployed industrial designer, but I'll take any opportunity to look at a ship's plans. So until next time, as always, stay safe, stay happy. I'll see you then. Ladies and gentlemen, it's your friend Mike Brady from Oceanliner Designs. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a comment below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel because we get new videos out weekly. If you want to support my work and get really cool perks like behind the scenes and early access, please visit my Patreon in the link in the description below, or sign up as a YouTube member. Come and join the crew. And as always, stay safe, stay happy, and I'll see you again next time.